We've got a few more seats kind of mixed in here. If you get a chance to come on in and get comfortable, we'll make sure the air conditioning stays on. So welcome everybody. Let me start by saying that welcome, and that we have some Spanish speaking translator and headsets. Should anybody need some additional headsets? We have Katie Voice with the Independent Living Center, Resource Center, here to help with sign language translation tonight. And I'm hoping that we have Mr. Eric Simmons on the phone line. Eric, are you there?
Yes, good evening. This is Eric Simmons.
Great, thank you, Eric. We're going to go ahead and get started, and we'll give a shout out to you here in a moment when we get our audio figured out. We also have Wendy from Congressman Carbajal's office here with us today. Wendy, raise your hand. There you are. So thank you for being here tonight as well. And we're going to start out with turning the microphone over to Supervisor Doss Williams, who's going to talk to us a little bit about what we're here tonight to talk about.
Well, I just want to welcome you all. I know that the entire community has been wondering what was going to come out in these maps, and I think they are a tool. I hope that you will view them as a tool and not as gospel, and I think there's some technical reasons to do that Mr. Fry can go into, but it also is part of the process of allowing people to rebuild, and so that is a very important juncture that we are at. This is mainly a product of standardized FEMA methodology. There are some assumptions that went into the model that Mr. Fry will go over. And we look forward to your questions, of which I'm sure there are many. And we do have FEMA staff on the phone, correct, with us tonight as well. Thank you for being here.
Thank you, Supervisor. So with the arrival of the FEMA flood mapping information, you know, it's something we've all been waiting for. It's something that we've all kind of been on pause for, so we could better understand what's changed in our community, what topography has changed, and those of you that are anxious to rebuild and get that final little bit of information, tonight is our opportunity to take a look at the information and provide you with some resources that are one-on-one so that we can answer the questions on a parcel-by-parcel basis. So the FEMA flood recovery maps, they serve to guide the rebuilding and long-term recovery. As the native vegetation above our communities reestablishes itself, we're still at risk, and we're going to be that way for the next few years until the vegetation takes hold. So tools such as these maps and other maps will help us redesign our structures and hopefully build a little more resiliency into our community. It's important to know a few things tonight. That this is a flood map. This is not a debris flow map. And there's a big distinction between the two. And I think later on, Mr. Fry is going to talk a little bit about that as well. This recovery mapping provides advisory flood elevations. And it is not going to be used solely for evacuations. Evacuations are going to be based upon all of our mapping tools and other information as we put together the plans for next fall and next winter storms. As everyone here knows, the 1/9 disaster changed the ground conditions, creating a need to remap the existing hazard conditions. Mapping the hazards is vital for disaster recovery and all of our rebuilding efforts, provides the data necessary for designing and permitting to reduce our risks. Next Tuesday, the Board of Supervisors is going to consider adopting the FEMA's recovery mapping. I'm not going to hear that. There it is. Oh, good deal. So next Tuesday, in front of our Board of Supervisors, they are going to adopt and consider the FEMA maps, which is, as we talked about, a critical part of the design. The purpose tonight is to get you some preliminary information so that we could get it out in anticipation of the adoption and try and get everyone meetings with their case managers. So our planning and development staff here have case managers that have already begun the one-on-one consultations with property owners. Our director, Diane Black, who's over here tonight, is going to talk a little bit about the various ways to contact the case managers, should some of you maybe not received emails and phone calls already. Our FEMA representatives are here on the phone tonight, and they're also planning on being here in cooperation with the Montecito Association for another community meeting on July 11th. That'll be another opportunity to get more information and work through additional questions that you may have. And with that, I'd like to introduce John Fry. He's our engineering manager with Flood Control District, who's going to walk us through the map, the legend, and what all the colors and numbers indicate. Thank you, John.
Thank you, Matt. Welcome, everybody. So glad that you can be here tonight. It's almost a relief to be here tonight. You've been all so patient. And now that we're here, let's talk about the map. The biggest question, it seems like we're getting right out the gate here, is like, how do I read the map? So I thought I'd take a couple minutes just to see what the different colors mean, and I'm pretty convinced that 5 minutes and you'll be able to understand what the map means. So this is a portion of the map that is a zoom in of an area. It doesn't matter what area we look at. This is a typical example of the entire mapping. I'll start with these yellow lines, which unfortunately in this particular view, the other side of the yellow line isn't shown, but over here somewhere there's another yellow line. And what the yellow lines mean is it denotes the limits of the areas that will get inundated in a 100-year flood event, an event that is utilizing a burned watershed scenario. That's what we have.
John, do you have someone to the direction?
Is this map movable?
That one is not, but it's pulled up so we can.
Okay, can I get some help with that, please? Because I know how to read maps, but I'm not all that good with clicking buttons. I'll click the wrong button and we'll lose the map. And while maybe somebody comes up and helps us with that, the yellow lines represent the areas of inundation. This is as Matt said, this is a flood map. It's a water map. And before I say anything else, I also wanted to compliment the FEMA team because they did a Herculean effort in putting this map together. The reason for this map is because the previous flood maps that we usually use to guide development in special flood hazard areas, they're called flood insurance rate maps. It was rendered really not usable after January 9th. The whole landscape changed. And so the information that was on that map wasn't really helpful. And FEMA has already agreed that they need to redo those flood insurance rate maps. That's a process that takes 4 or 5 years. They've already started that, okay? But we didn't want to wait 4 or 5 years in this community to get guidance in how we can rebuild in these hazard areas. And this is a high hazard area. And we'll always emphasize, as has already been mentioned tonight, that this is a flood map, it's a water map, it's not a debris flow map, okay? It's not an evacuation map. It's not going to be used for insurance. So that's another question that we're getting a lot of is, how does this affect my insurance? And it's not. They're going to continue to use the flood insurance rate maps for that. So anyway, my hat's off to FEMA for the effort that they put in for this. So if we can, okay, there we go. This is a much better view. Thank you. So again, I'll just repeat. I'll point over here. Well, I'll point over here so if everybody can see. And if you can't see, let me know, okay? And I'll do it again. Okay, so I'm in your way. Okay, let me just talk from the side here, if I could. That's probably the best thing to do. Thank you, help me here. Okay, so yellow to yellow, areas of inundation, okay? A 100-year rainfall event with a runoff that's from a burned watershed. And it's also taking into consideration the landscape that was left behind after December 9th. That's another pretty amazing thing about this mapping, is that the state and the federal resources were able to put together a topographic map.
Please point to the yellow line.
Okay. So, okay. Does that help? Does that help? Okay, okay. Perfect. This is Hansel, by the way, and he's a mapping guy. So I think we're in good hands here. So right here, yellow to yellow, all right? Or over here, yellow to yellow. Those represent areas that are going to get wet in a 100-year rainfall event, as I described. Burned watershed, landscape from January 9th, which includes all the deposition. There were channels that were filled in. What this map also includes is an assumption that the bridges and culverts are plugged. Okay, so that's, I think, an important point to describe. The FEMA flood insurance rate maps, as a rule, generally only contemplate like a clear water flow, okay? Water that doesn't really carry debris or rock, woody vegetation. But I'd like to ask anybody here to describe a flood event that we've had that doesn't bring down debris. We'll call them debris-laden floods. They're not debris flows, but channels fill in, culverts plug, bridges plug. That's common. And so we think that this model represents a much truer picture of the threat and the risk. That's one of the assumptions that went into the map. It is a model. It's not perfect. And even the best of modeling experts can disagree on the results of a model. That's just the inherent nature of hydrologic and hydraulic modeling. So, but this was done by FEMA and their mapping experts. This is what they do. So, yellow lines, inundated areas. So within those yellow lines, maybe we can pull up, okay, yeah, this is good. This is good. So within those yellow lines, you're going to see blue shading. And the blue shading is in gradations, different light blue, medium blue, dark blue. And there's a legend that describes the lightest blue is from 6 inches to 12 inches. The next shade is, I think, 12 inches to 36, and then on. It's actually right here. It's kind of small to see, but it gets deep. The deeper the blue, the deeper the water. And I'll say, generally speaking, if you notice the deepest blue, that's following the creek, all right? So that's generally what the map is showing. So that's the depth of the floodwaters at any given particular location. So you'll also notice that within the yellow to yellow inundated areas, there's areas that aren't shaded at all. And those represent areas that are a depth of 6 inches or less. So 0 to 6 inches, unshaded areas. We're going to be applying, if the board adopts this map, these hazard areas. FEMA defines yellow to yellow as a hazard area. So we'll be using this, if the board adopts, this in place basically of the flood insurance rate map that was rendered not usable. And so we will apply the county floodplain management ordinance to this map. I will say that that ordinance, that's been on the books for decades and decades. The requirement in that ordinance is that the lowest finished floor elevation of the newly constructed structure needs to be built such that it is at least 2 feet above what these are being called as advisory flood elevations, okay? Can we add the pink?
Sure, the water surface?
The contours, yeah. And I'm sure everybody that's looked at this thing, when you first pull it up, it's like it's all pink. It's like a solid color. But when you zoom in, you know, it's not solid anymore. And what you can see is this series of lines. Each line has a number tagged to it. All right. The numbers happen to be in 2 foot increments. Those numbers represent, and the pink lines represent lines of equal water surface elevation. It's the equivalent, I would say, if you've ever seen a topographic map of say a ground survey. Say a surveyor goes out and shoots the elevations and they create this nice looking map. It's got these contour lines. Those contour lines represent points of equal elevation above a certain elevation datum. Well, this is the same here. It's just, this is a water map, not a land map. And so these contours are, again, they're representing points of equal water surface elevation. So, like if I just point right here, okay, that looks to be like an 80. So what that's telling me is that where I pointed, the water surface elevation is elevation 80. Let me also add to everybody here, before I forget, I consider this map, which is publicly available and posted, to be a graphical representation of the results of the FEMA mapping, of the modeling. Okay, it's graphical. That's the way I categorize it. You have to, look at, for a water surface contour, you have to discern the shade of blue to know what the depth is. Our staff has been provided with reams of digital data, okay? So that, for example, when someone comes in with their one-on-one meeting with their P&D case manager, flood control is a part of those meetings, and they have access at their hand to that digital information, and they'll be able to zoom in at the point of interest and determine what an advisory flood elevation is to the 10th of a foot. And that's the level of detail that we will be going to. We won't be using this to determine the advisory flood elevation, although graphically it'll tell you kind of what ballpark you're in. So, I mean, that's really what this map shows. Yellow to yellow, inundated limits, no shading within that, 6 inches and less. If it's blue, it's the depth as indicated on the legend. Flood control has the digital information through the modern mapping tools that we all use now. I also want to say another question that we get is like, okay, so how do I know what like my ground elevation is? Or how do I know what my ground elevation like was before January 9th? Ground elevation after January 9th is captured in this mapping, and part of the data that we've been provided by FEMA allows us to go into those data layers, if that's what you call them, and we can with a fairly precise level of accuracy determine what those ground elevations are. Now keep in mind, that's representing a January I believe the flight was January 16th. It was, a week or 10 days after the debris flow event. So we have that data. And my vision here is that when you get into the one-on-one, then our folks will be able to drill down and give you all of that data, okay? I find it useful when I look at it, and I think you all will too. Now, as far as your ground surfaces before, we really don't have that information readily available, but there are data sources available. Like, for example, unrelated to the debris flow, we've had posted on our flood control website for like years aerial topographic mapping. It was done like 20, 25 years ago. It's not to a level of detail like this is. That's a place to start. I was speaking with someone weeks ago, and they pointed out, well, you know, if you've ever had a building case go through in the past 5 years, who knows, maybe you had to have a land survey at that time. You know, maybe you could, or maybe the previous property owner did. Maybe you could go down to, I don't know if the building records contain that information or not, but anyway, you have to kind of research and look at what's out there to get the debris flow topographic information. We don't really have that information readily available. So again, this is the map. It's not an evacuation map, it's not a debris flow map, it's not a flood insurance map, but it is going to guide our recovery in terms of determining minimum finished floor elevations if you're located within what the map is identified as a hazard area. I don't think I said that term, but yellow to yellow is a hazard area. So that's the map.
Okay, so before we turn it over to a whole lot of questions, which a lot of us have, I'm going to turn it over real quick to Diane Black, our planning director, and we're going to put a slide up here that talks about our case managers a little bit. So Diane?
Great. Well, I think if you've been to any of these meetings before, you've probably heard this before, but we have, the Planning and Development Department has set up a system of case managers to meet with property owners who've been affected by the debris flow and the flood. And we are really encouraging people to come in and meet with their case managers. And up on this screen, you'll see a phone number to call, an email address, and then you can also come into the zoning counter to schedule meetings. And we are scheduling meetings with the case planner that's assigned to your site, as well as a flood control staff person, so that you can get good information and good direction about next steps in the building process. So I encourage people, if you haven't already met with your case managers or don't have an appointment scheduled, to do that. And I know some of you have already engaged experts. Bring your experts with you, your architect, a surveyor, engineer, if you have them. If you don't, it's fine. Come and talk to us, and we'll try and help you as best we can through the process. That's what we're here for. And the people sitting next to me at the table, Jeff Wilson is our Deputy Director of Development Review, and he's really kind of heading up our effort with planning and development. And then two of our case managers, Ray Montana and Tess Harris. And we have quite a few others as well, so that you might see these people and you may see other people, but we're all here wanting to help people and give you good information and help you through the process.
Thank you, Diane. So I'm sure a lot of us have the same questions. So in an effort to try and make sure that we're able to hear the audio for the folks watching at home, if you could make your way to a couple of the microphone in the back, or if you're close by, raise your hand and I'll hand you mine. But let's see if we can get some questions here answered. And we've got some folks here and folks on the phone line that are ready to answer some questions. So with that, let's start it out in the back of the room.
Hi, my name is Marshall Miller. I am a property owner in what is now the yellow zone. What is the appropriate process for appealing an inaccuracy in the map? In my particular case, our pool happened to be empty on the day of the flyover, so there's a little dark blue spot where there would be 10 feet of water potential, and we kind of want it to be flooded with 10 feet of water because it's our swimming pool.
Right.
So
that makes a lot of sense, actually.
But my concern is that to have a dark blue dot in our backyard has property value implications that are disconnected from. So to generalize the question, what is the appropriate process for looking for kind of map revisions or edits to an issue my issue, but issues like that.
So thank you for the question. That's a good one that I'm sure a lot of us in the room have. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Eric, who's going to speak loudly and clearly so we can all hear him, and let us know what that process is.
This is Eric Simmons, and I had a little difficulty hearing the question. Was it in regards to the letter map change process?
So Eric, the question really was based on if we have a situation where there's an inaccuracy in the map itself, or something that's noted, on the property, and maybe it came out kind of odd on the map, what's the process by which they contact, who do they contact with that information in question, and talk about changes?
Okay. Yeah, I've provided my contact information and continue to do that and work closely with Santa Barbara County and John Fry in that the mapping that was distributed and made available on Monday is what we have and are confident in. But if there's immediate questions or concerns, we're looking into those. And I believe the county has stated that in the future, they're working with property owners and others as conditions could change, to refine that. But, in the short term, let's say now, and as you mentioned, I'll be down in Santa Barbara on July 11th. We'll be happy to take those comments and evaluate those.
Okay, Eric, thank you. Maybe I should have been a little more specific on this particular case, because this case, there's a blue dot where there was a swimming pool in the backyard. And certainly as it comes up on the map, it's trying to depict something else because of the depression and the low-lying dug-out swimming pool. And popped up on this map because of the elevation or the swimming pool itself. But that's the scenario on this one, and we'll go ahead and get your contact information here up on the screen. So Eric, could you hear that last part of the scenario?
Yes, regarding the swimming pool.
Right.
Again, I'll continue to coordinate with primarily John Fry, but others at Santa Barbara County, and if we need to make an update to the recovery map, we'll do that.
Okay, thank you, Eric. I'm going to turn it over to John Fry, who wants to add some additional information to this one.
Yeah, and I don't think Eric was able to really hear the premise of your question. That's actually an easy question to answer. It really is. We'll be able to deal with that locally very, very quickly. I mean, a swimming pool in the backyard, it is going to show 10 feet of water or whatever, which is what you want. We'll be able to handle those very, very quickly. So that's the way I see it anyway.
And I think he was also concerned about, future for value and different things, if that affected.
I appreciate the flexibility and the understanding by local planning and development. I'm very grateful for that, so I want to express sincere gratitude. But it's still an issue to have a map where there's a dark blue dot in the backyard in terms of overall insurance questions and whatnot. How do we, aside from relying on the reasonableness of planning and development overall, which I would count on, how do we actually revise the map itself for something like that seems like a data error?
Well, I mean, if I were working one-on-one with you, I would probably suggest, well, let's just start off by offering to talk to your insurance company. We can put a letter on flood control letterhead. I'd like to think that something as straightforward as that could work. Because if they are such that they need, and if we're talking down the line here, if other of these situations come up, say 2 years from now, to go back to FEMA for swimming pool, that's just a burden on everybody. I'd like to think, I could be wrong, that insurance company would take our statement that, hey, this is a swimming pool. This blue represents a swimming pool, not a flood threat. That's how I would approach it, and then take it from there.
And so, John, you'd be able to amend the map based on the knowledge that that's a swimming pool?
Well, I would perhaps, under the authority of the local flood control district, make a statement. You know, in fact, the FEMA map change process here, and maybe Eric Simmons can help me out here a little bit, but the typical flood insurance rate map, not only in Santa Barbara County here, but across the country, FEMA has set up a process for identifying map changes or map errors. They call that letters of map amendments, or there's any other number of mechanisms. That's for the flood insurance rate maps. Those are regulatory maps. This recovery mapping, keep in mind that this isn't going to be used for insurance purposes. That's probably the first thing I should have said instead of talking about sending a letter to the insurance company. But it's not an insurance rate map, number one. And then if that doesn't satisfy them, let us try that letter of authority thing with the flood control district. I'm willing to give that a shot.
This is Wendy with Congressman Carbajal's office. I just wanted to be clear and say what John has said. This is not a FEMA rate insurance map. That is a whole different process. So this map was done, as John said, very quickly for FEMA to assist the county in the building application process. And so John is saying that he's going to work with you. He believes the building department will work with you and look at each property separately. I hope that helps a little.
No, it absolutely does, and I don't mean to make my individual problem the problem of everybody in this room, but to the extent that it is potentially a more generalized question, the applicability of it is solely for county planning and development, or is it the kind of thing that would trigger entitle report work or those kinds of things of what realm of flood inundation are you in? As a citizen, not that I don't trust my government and love my government, but I get nervous for where a data set can kind of wander, if you will.
Thank you for that. No, flood control is using it to guide reconstruction in the hazard area, as identified on this map. Now, we don't have control if somebody else gets their hands on this and uses it for nefarious purposes. I mean, we would support against that. But we're using it to identify high hazard areas, and we'll continue to emphasize these are high hazard areas, and that's why, you know, we've got this map.
So let me add one more thing to that, and that is that as these unique situations, I'm glad we started with the pool, because that sounds a little more fun than some of the other things, but as these kind of issues come to us, we're going to be taking note of them, and we're going to supply a whole list of these to FEMA, because, you know, they did their best they could. I know that we and our team did the best we could to try and tweak things, to make things right on the ground, but we didn't catch everything, I'm sure. And so I think what Eric was saying on the phone was that, hey, he's happy to listen to and hear the different scenarios. We're going to try and bundle those together as much as possible, send them over to FEMA, and work with them to see if we can adjust the map moving forward. Okay. Next question.
Hi. My name's Karen Feeny, and I guess I have a couple questions. I'll ask them one at a time. And one just got added because of this conversation. I had heard over the last couple of months that these maps would be used to generate 4 to 5 years down the road, the new firm maps, the insurance maps. Is that not the case?
So let me turn to our FEMA representative on the phone for that. Eric, did you hear that question okay?
Unfortunately, I did not. I heard a flood insurance rate map, but that's about it.
Do you want to repeat it for him? Or?
You know, why don't you take this microphone? This one might work a little bit better.
Okay. So, over the last few months, as we've been waiting for these base flood elevation maps to come out, it was my understanding that they would be used by FEMA to generate new firm, I don't have the exact terminology of that name, but flood insurance maps for basing flood insurance rates and all that. So I'm just wanting to understand if that is the case or not. Did you hear me?
The new recovery map will not be used to revise the flood insurance rate map. There is a separate process to update and revise flood insurance rate maps for entire watersheds, and that has not yet begun. FEMA will be coordinating with Santa Barbara County and the cities. A first step in that is called discovery, where we have discussions and talk about the scope of the needs, not just what flood insurance rate map panels should be updated based on changes in conditions, but also rebuilding and building safer, on possible mitigation opportunities, that is, ways future losses can be reduced. And that's a separate process. So no, the flood insurance rate map update has not begun.
So, question number 2.
Please,
Use that?
go ahead.
Want to use that?
Oh, yeah, I think it might help.
Okay.
Let's just hang out back here.
So, what is the relationship of the 2012 maps to anything that we need to determine the change in the base flood elevation? Is there any relationship with that map? Or are we really looking at topography maps from surveys or what you have from 25 years ago?
Well, that's a great question. I'm glad you asked it, because I should have brought this up before. One thing that we have to do when you come in one-on-one with your case manager is, for any given property, we're going to be looking at the recovery mapping, but we also have to look at the flood insurance rate maps. And if it turns out that those reflect a higher base flood elevation than what the recovery mapping does, then that's the elevation that controls, okay? So that's how I see we will continue to be using those 2012 flood insurance rate maps.
If there's a difference, I'm sorry, could you just repeat that again? I didn't
Okay,
follow
sure.
it.
Yeah, no. So we have the flood insurance rate maps. They happen to have a date of 2012.
Okay.
And that's what we've been using, for development. January 9th rendered them really unusable, for the most part. They are still used for insurance purposes, as we've said, but FEMA has provided us with this new recovery map. And so what I tried to say is that we have to look at both maps for any given property.
Okay.
And then we just take the higher of the two.
Oh, okay.
And if that's the 2012 map, then that's the 2012 map. And that's per FEMA regulations, and so those are the rules.
Okay. My last question, and that is, if the home that was damaged is already at the base flood elevation plus 2 feet higher than the base flood elevation as indicated in the 2018 maps, do we have to go through the whole calculation of the 50% or more for the permitting for the repairs and such? That, I don't mean to open up a whole new area of conversation here, but right now it's my understanding that you have to determine whether or not the damage to the home was 50% or less or 50% or more of the value of the home. So how does that play into it at all?
Okay, no, that's a good question. I'm glad you brought it up, and I'm gonna glance over at some of my colleagues here, make sure I answer this correctly. If I understand the premise of your question, you have a structure that's already at a lowest finished floor elevation of at least 2 feet above the flood elevation, right?
Of the 2018 maps, yeah.
Of the recovery mapping, right? Then you're already in conformance, if these maps are adopted, okay, by the board. You're already in conformance. So I think the answer is you don't have to go through that process. Well, okay, so under that scenario, okay, so the question is, what if the 2012 mapping is higher? Okay, well, if you do not conform to that, and in fact, that almost throws it into it's not even related to the event, right? Those would have been the rules anyway. So the question is, what if the 2012 mapping is actually higher and you're not at the +2 feet? Well, then, yeah, you do got to go through that. Those are very, very roughly, there's a 50% rule. Applies to either damages or like improvements if you want to add an addition or something. Okay, so it roughly states that the cost of that, there's a certain category of costs that apply. There's a certain category of costs that do not apply. But if that value exceeds 50% of the appraised value of the structure, not including property, but the appraised value of the structure, and this would be pre-January 9, then if it exceeds 50%, then you got to bring it up to this 2012 plus 2 feet. Is that right? Okay, good.
Hi, you've stressed that this is a map based on a clear water flood event, not a debris flow. And you've also said that we're unlikely to get a clear water flood event. We're much more likely to get a debris flow. Are we going to get a debris flow map? And will there be any planning for the future based on a debris flow map? Because we've already had problems with operating on the wrong map. We had a flood evacuation based on a fire map, and now I'm concerned that we're going to have a rebuilding effort based on a flood map and not on a debris flow map.
These questions are reminding me of things that I forgot to mention when I was up front, so thank you. Question about, is there going to be a debris flow map? Okay, what we have in hand and what our staff is going to be going over with the one-on-one is not only the recovery mapping, but the California Geological Survey provided us a debris flow limits map that was based on January 9th. They had their people out there, like immediately afterwards, measuring and monitoring from top to bottom what the limits of the debris flow were. Okay, so for purposes of flood control's involvement here, when people come in one-on-one, we're going to be going over the recovery mapping, but we're also, on the other hand, going to be looking at that California Geological Survey map. And that map also includes, I might add, they took, where they could, measurements of the depth of observed debris flow depth, which is, say, for example, the measurement from a mud line on a building to the deposited, what was left behind. So say that was 5 feet. We have a map that depicts that.
But are the general contoured outlines that show where the flood is going to go, are those the same contoured outlines that would apply to a debris flow, and it's just a question of depth within those contoured lines, or is the debris flow likely to occur in other areas?
I want to answer your question correctly, and I want to make sure I understand your question. You're asking, will the debris flow basically follow sort of the pattern
Correct.
of the recovery map? The answer is it's apples and oranges, okay? The recovery map is a water model. Water behaves much differently than even mud, and even different than debris. So what we have in hand right now that is the best available information is this California Geological Survey mapping. And we want to make that available to everybody, and they're certainly going to be available in these one-on-one meetings with the case planner.
No, I absolutely understand that, but if debris behaves very differently from clear water, wouldn't it make sense to base recovery and rebuilding on debris, on what's likely to be the next problem, and not on clear water, which is very unlikely to be our next problem?
Well, I have said that the mapping is a water model, and we've talked about clear water, but there have been assumptions put into this recovery mapping, and we have the FEMA study contractors online, and if I don't answer this question adequately, I'm going to look to them for support. But there have been some modeling assumptions put into the water model to try to better replicate a debris-laden flood, okay? For example, the plug bridges. You know, that's a really good modeling assumption. Furthermore, they took these post-burn flows that we were talking about on a burned watershed, and they applied what they call bulking factors. That kind of increases the discharges in the creeks as well. And so that's kind of trying to trick the model into thinking that it's a debris-laden flood, even though it's the operations of the model are as a water flow. So debris flow mapping, there's no way we're going to get debris flow mapping in a matter of months. There's just no way. It's very complex. It's nearly impossible, from the experts that I've heard, to predict where debris flows are going to go.
Will any further effort be made along those lines, or are we just sort of calling it off now that we have the FEMA map?
The answer is yes. The board has allocated funds to do continued study of debris flow mapping.
Great.
I think what's pretty important to think about is that this FEMA map would be the minimum that we would show, the minimum that the county would allow, minimum elevation for a rebuild. It does not mean it is the advisable level to rebuild. It does not mean that it's the safe level to rebuild. I personally never want to see this community go through something like the 1-9 debris flow again. And I think that each individual, as they look at a plan to rebuild, should be looking to have the most resilient plan to rebuild that they can do. In most cases, it would be advisable to look at locations and elevations that maximize that resilience. And this, again, isn't gospel. It's just the minimum that we are going to require if we adopt it. I do think the geological survey is a good thing for people to look at as they are trying to rebuild. Say, this is the best information we have at a debris flow, this is the best information we have at in a flood model, and compare them, because there are still going to be places that would be inadvisable to
Understood,
rebuild.
but if you're saying that you were generating a plan that is going to give us buildings that are not necessarily either advisable or safe, would it make sense to wait until we have information that gives us something that is advisable and is safe?
The problem, as I understand it, is that there is not a statutory connection for debris flow. There is for flood. This is done from a flood basis, and they've included a lot of mechanisms to try to trick the model into being as close to a debris flow as they could. But we are operating under state law and in insurance cases federal law, and so it needs to be connected to that law, and that law is under flood. Again, I think that every individual's got to make some responsible decisions themselves. I definitely want to have flood control be able to truth test this on a case-by-case basis. There are maybe places where the model missed something, and we want to be able to say in those cases that flood control can spot something and make an adjustment. If we wait for the perfect information, people will, number one, we may never have it, and number two, people will lose their total value of their homes and not be able to rebuild, and then maybe a moot point by the time that people go bankrupt and can't rebuild.
So this is a question, I'm Paul Poirier, I'm an architect in town, and it's a question I first thought was for John Fry, but maybe, and the other map nerds in the room, but maybe it's also for the folks that hold the purse strings. Maybe about 10 years ago, the flood control department had the best maps in town in vector format, so we could go and purchase from them a AutoCAD drawing of a certain quadrant that would show all the topography and all the existing structures in a certain area, as opposed to a PDF, which is, not lines in vector format that could be manipulated. And I think that a lot of money has been spent to generate the mapping that we just saw today, and it would be really awesome, and it would save all of the people that are going to be rebuilding some money if that was available to them in vector format, so that we can do some rough site design on the existing contour, which nobody has as of up until after January 9th. And then a detailed survey could be put in place on the areas that need to be fine-tuned. So if that were able to come out in DWG or DXF, where you could use that in AutoCAD software, Revit software, or modeling software, if it's even a 3D model, which you currently have, and if you were able to share that with the community, it'd be great.
Answer is yes. Anything that FEMA has provided to us, and we've already had a number of requests for that data. So we've been providing that. These are very, very large data files, but there's ways they are able to share through file sharing accounts. So the answer is yes.
Yeah, if you could slice it and dice it so that you don't have to get the whole model, that'd be awesome.
I'm not sure about slicing and dicing. I mean, we're going to allow you to do your magic, okay? We're maybe not in a position with the resources to slice and dice for each and every, all right? We'll provide you what we have, and then you can go for it.
Hi, I'm Phil Hogan. I'm a professional geologist and geomorphologist. I also live in Montecito. I assisted the California Geological Survey and the U.S. Forest Service geomorphologists with some of the debris flow, inundation, and elevation mapping in February and March of this year. I've got a few comments that I would like to make, and then a couple of questions. Firstly, based upon your presentation, John.
Can I interrupt you? And I hate to do that, but if this is a question that may end up going to FEMA, can we maybe get Matt's mic to you?
He actually has my mic.
Oh, okay, I'm sorry. That was I'm sorry.
Hey, you're more than welcome to come up here.
That's okay.
Oh, yeah, maybe just closer.
Okay, I'll just hold it closer to my mouth so you can hear me better. John, based upon your presentation, it sounds like the new maps that were, the recovery maps that were released earlier this week were based upon airborne LiDAR data that was collected around January 16th or thereabouts. Since that time, the elevation of Montecito has changed dramatically as a result of removal of hundreds or tens of thousands of truckloads of material from both private and public property. Also, there's been grading for new construction on our street. I live on Miramar Avenue. The Miramar Hotel has regraded our street such that the water will flow away from our house to the north side of the street rather than draining down our side of the street with a crown in the middle of the road. My comment really, or the comment where I'm going here with this is that if the new flood map or recovery map is based upon this January 16th airborne LiDAR data, and the topography has changed so dramatically since then, is it really valid? I would think that it's not, because the topography has changed a lot since January 16th or thereabouts. So one question is there going to be another airborne LiDAR survey done? And if so, will these maps be redone before being finalized?
So I can help answer part of that question. That was one of the things that we wrestled with early on, is because, just as you said, those initial LiDAR maps were based upon the debris basins being full, the creek channels being full, the roads had a lot of extra sediment and stuff on them. And since then, as you illustrated, a lot of folks have removed a lot of debris from the community of Montecito. So we do feel it's important to update those maps. We do know that it's going to take a while and a lot of finances for that. And as Supervisor Williams talked about earlier, they set aside some money to improve and get some more up-to-date LiDAR maps. And we're hoping to either re-engage the geological survey groups or private consulting firms, and then run those same kind of similar analysis on the new LiDAR data. We just know that that's going to take a little time, right? I mean, they really crammed together to get what we had initially so that we kind of understood what had happened. But I think it's going to take months and months to get that done, even as we push the contracts and those kind of things. So we certainly think that it's a super important part of the puzzle, and are going to push for that. One of the things that we have been concerned about internally is, what about the rains? And, you know, we wanted to get this information before then, so we had a little better idea. And as John illustrated earlier, we're currently just going off of those maps until we have a new map, but that certainly is in our plan. So.
But hopefully this convinces you. If you weren't convinced the first 8 times we asked you to not remove any mud that you don't have to, hopefully this convinces anyone who is still contemplating to not, because they will dig themselves in deeper into the flood zone.
Understood. Another comment is that I drilled down on the website on Monday or Tuesday to evaluate the map and make sense of it, and I read all the comments down the left-hand side of the map that explained the map in some level of detail, and it referred to a legend. Most maps, geologic or otherwise, have a legend, and many of the other maps on the county website have a link to the legend. I, for the life of me, could not find the legend to this map, and I found that frustrating, and I would suggest that perhaps the county have a link to the legend for the new map.
So I'm going to turn to John. Do we not have a link to a legend for the map? Oh. So, John?
I don't know that we have a direct link to the legend. I'll look at IT people to see if that can be done. But as was mentioned, you have to go to that upper right corner and click one of them boxes, and then that pulls up a kind of a window or a panel with a bunch of stuff on it, and the legend is at the bottom of it. So. That's where the legend is. So,
okay.
And while I got the mic here, I want to thank you for your work with the CGS, okay, and in mapping those that.
Well,
there's the legend right there. But
I enjoyed going to the field with Brian Swanson.
The men and women of the CGS have a very special place. What they've done for our community, it's just. I can't thank you enough, so thank you.
It was my pleasure. I enjoyed it, and I like doing community service, and I plan on doing more going forward. I look forward to seeing the CGS, that's the California Geological Survey report, that's going to be coming out sometime in the next couple of months. It sounds like you've already got a preview of that. So that will be available to the public online. And it's specifically focused on the January 9th debris flow, inundation mapping, elevation mapping. There will also be a report that will be published by the U.S. Forest Service. And I'm not sure on the timing of the release of that, but that's something we should all look forward to seeing as well, because it'll provide additional information. Finally, for those of you who aren't aware of it, the UCSB Geology Earth Sciences Department, along with a geomorphologist, Tim Dunn, and a separate department, are doing a major research project on the debris flow, as well as looking for the future and trying to predict the recurrence interval of these large-scale debris flow events. We experienced one this year. We don't know how frequently they occur. The last major one that affected Santa Barbara was about 1,000 years ago. It came down Rattlesnake Canyon and inundated much of downtown Santa Barbara. One final comment, and that's about our house personally. I saw on the map that that new recovery map has a elevation of 36 feet, so we're actually in the 0 to 6 inch range that you described, so it's not in the color zone. But I was a little surprised by that because the elevations of the floodwaters and debris flows on January 9th were 15 or 20 feet below the elevation of our house, and the Miramar whole site did not flood. Humphrey Road and areas to the east did, over towards San Ysidro Creek, but I was a little shocked by that. And then I looked at our personal plans for our house that we remodeled a few years ago, and the finished floor elevation is 38.1 feet. So we're 1/10 of a foot above the 2-foot buffer. So I guess we just got lucky, dodged a bullet there. But my heart goes out to all of you in the community who are affected in a more detrimental way than me and my family. Thank you.
And I think we are advising anyone rebuilding to look at that map that he participated in as part of you making an informed decision about how to rebuild.
Thanks, Matt. Mike Davenport, I'm a resident of Montecito, and you know, when I'm looking at the map, the part that has concerned me is, you know, it's characterized as a high-risk area, right? So I mean, that's conveying something very serious. And I look at some areas, and I brought pictures of them because it was just, I was trying to match it up in my mind to make sure I was looking at this correctly, because I spent a lot of time helping people dig out. And I look at some houses that are totally destroyed or are set to be destroyed, and they're not in a high-risk area. At the same time, I look at, and one of them, someone unfortunately died in the house. So I have a hard time matching that up in my mind as to how that can be when it's along a creek. And then I look at where my house sits, and it's defined as being in the high-risk area. And we had no mud flows, there was no mud flows close to us. And when I look at it from a flood exposure standpoint and look at the topography, it seems to me there's not enough boots on the ground in this process. This is a model. I understand, I work in insurance. I'm an officer for an insurance company. I do underwriting. I understand flood models. And as you said, they're models, and models are wrong. I mean, they're always wrong. They're a tool, as you said. But this particular tool, when it's over-inclusive in areas, you know, you're conveying a very serious message saying it's a high-hazard area. And when you say that, that is going to impact property values. It's going to impact property taxes because it impacts property values. And it does impact insurance. And I agree, it does not impact federal flood insurance. It does impact private insurance, which all of us buy. That is the more expensive component of insurance if you're not in a floodplain. Because as an underwriter, when you look at a map like this and it says high hazard area, that conveys something that says, oh, maybe I don't want to write in that area. It also says that, gee, if I have to justify to my boss why I wrote this property, I should probably charge more writing in that area than a house right next door that's not in that area. So I would really encourage you guys to go back and look at this and look at the areas that didn't have any damage, actually get people in those neighborhoods and look at those areas, because as you guys said, this is a map that it sounds like we're going to live with for 4 or 5 years. You know, when you look at the yellow and red evacuation map that we already have, that is getting taken into account by people looking to buy houses. I've seen several listings coming, you know, all the realtors send us things in the mail. And you look at the comments of people that are looking to buy houses, and one of the comments that I've seen several times now is, do you have, you know, I got 3 kids, I want a 4-bedroom house, about 3,000 square feet, not in the red zone. So these maps have real-world implications, and it's not just about deciding how to do evacuations. It's not about how to do rebuilding, particularly in areas where there's no rebuilding to do. I don't need to do any rebuilding. My house wasn't damaged. So I really think these maps need to be re-looked at before the Board of Supervisors acts, and limit them to the areas where there was actually debris flows, where there's actually damage to repair.
Comments on that?
I can try to respond partly. again, the recovery mapping is based on a water model, and I don't want to be repetitive here, but I heard an analogy the other day that helped me understand and maybe help explain. A water model, imagine taking a big bucket of water and throwing it out there. The water is going to spread out like kind of all over the place, right? Take a bucket of mud or say wet concrete and throw it out. It kind of just, it doesn't do that. It doesn't do what water does. It just kind of, sticks, And I think that demonstrates, at least for me, what we've learned over the past 4 or 5 months, that the physics of a debris flow are one thing, and they are not the same as the flow of water. Now, point well taken about these homes that were destroyed tragically and are not in this recovery hazard area, right? The way I see that is because those homes, at least the ones I'm thinking of, they ended up being filled in with, I don't know how much deposition, okay? 5 feet, 6 feet, whatever, maybe more. And so that became a part of the landscape that was considered in this modeling. And so that's why we'll always continue to emphasize that these are high hazard areas. The recovery mapping is a water mapping. We want to emphasize the California Geological Survey debris flow mapping because those destroyed structures are certainly right in those mapped areas from the CGS. So that's why we're trying to emphasize we have to utilize the best of all available information and hopefully make really good decisions moving forward.
And I'll just add that the quandary, for us on Tuesday is going to be that a model can be improved, right? Do we want to take time to improve that model and not adopt the map, which would cause people to have to wait to rebuild throughout the community, everybody? Or do we want to, because as I understand it, these maps are discretionary actions on the part of the county, adopt a map and revise it as any information that we can gather becomes available? And that's a tough decision. I invite you all to advise me on that one.
Thank you, Mike.
I have a thought on that, Des. My thought is that the board can accept this map provisionally, and on all the areas that have not been, where there's not actual damage, that no one actually is looking to rebuild, I think those areas need to be re-looked at in very short order and set a provision that within 60 days or 90 days, the board is going to go back and adopt a new map. And maybe at that point, the map doesn't change because for whatever, you guys look at the map, it all makes perfect sense, you're happy. But I think you're doing a disservice to the collective taxpayers of Santa Barbara County because I do honestly believe this map is going to have significant impacts to the values of the properties in those areas. And I don't think it's reflective of reality. I think to be honest, I think it creates more fear in the community than is justified based on the topography that exists when I look at the areas I know well. So, for what it's worth, I appreciate your guys' time.
Thank you, Mark.
I think I know the answer to this question, but I'm going to pose it as a question anyway. I'm an architect. I'm a resident of Montecito. We've been helping a number of people through this process, but one of the issues that comes up that I think people are unclear about, that needs to be made clear to them, is there are kind of two issues. One is complying with the new flood map and deciding what elevation you might rebuild your house at. But the other issue that people I think are not fully clear about is that whatever you build, and especially in the instance of this 50% rule, is that any new construction will comply to the new 2016 California Building Code. All these buildings, any kind of structures that we're building, either repairing, all will be built to the new code. And the 50% rule triggers making the rest of your house that may not be damaged also having the necessity to be brought up to code. You know, there are seismic implications, energy implications involved. I mean, it's a kind of complicated matrix of things about how to make this work, but I think that many people are kind of very focused on what's happening with the flood map and where their house is going, and are not really fully aware that there are building and safety implications involved as well. And I think it is kind of incumbent upon the county to kind of make it clear to people what the whole process is going to look like that includes that. So
we
it's a
really
question
appreciate
that comes
that
up to us all the time.
Yeah. No, it definitely, that's why you see a lot of AIA partners and groups here, just because that is such an important part of the whole overall picture. And there's a lot of nuances to that, and you know, we know our case managers would be advising that also, but to publicly recognize that, we appreciate that, absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
I was handed a question that was written out, so I'm going to read the question, then I'll try to answer the question. It has to do with this 50% rule, so it's a great segue here. How is valuation determined? Valuation perhaps of the new construction, I'm not sure exactly if they're referring to that, or perhaps the appraised value of the existing structure. I can answer both of those questions. The appraised value of the existing structure has to be done by an appraiser, a professional appraiser. So they will appraise the structure before it was damaged, and then that becomes that baseline number that you will then compare the cost of the repairs themselves. Okay, and we have information that categorizes what costs are included. Many are, and some aren't. And then, so those that are, that's what becomes the number that you compare against. Has it already been determined? Has it already determined or new? Has it already determined or new? Well, I'll try to answer this question if I understand it. We haven't determined any of these numbers. These numbers are up to the applicant to determine. We don't do that. And are they new? Well, no, you're not going to take the value of a brand new structure, say when it was built. You're going to take the value as it existed, you know, before the damages. So I hope I answered the question.
Can I comment on that? That's my question. And for example, on our tax bill, land is valued and the structure is valued. But oftentimes that valuation was 30, 20 years ago, maybe 5 years ago. And so would it be that valuation, has that already been determined? Or does each individual have to hire an appraiser? And will that appraiser then say, this is the value of your structure prior to December 2017 for the value of your structure now?
Okay, thank you for clarifying that, because now I can better answer the question. The thought or the idea of using that appraised value that shows up on your tax bill for the structure only was something that we had suggested would be a number to start with. Because, I mean, if you think about it, that is probably a low number. That kind of works against you, actually. But if the value of your repairs aren't all that much, that'd be a quick, easy way to do it. Unfortunately, the code doesn't give us that ability. The code says it has to be a registered or a certified appraiser, whatever the term is. So, unfortunately, that approach, that won't work for us.
So another thing I might want to add here is Joe Holland, our county assessor, it does have a team of folks that are out there and doing some assessments on the ground, and I think they're still completing their work, and when they finish up, we'll get that information back out to everybody to understand, you know, what they found, what they did during their survey, and what changed during that. Okay, do we have another question?
A little nervous here.
All right, step right up.
I'm living back east right now, but Randall Road, Kathy Waldruff, I'm wondering about setbacks. I've talked to him one time, and because it did not come over San Ysidro Creek to our property, it widened on the Park Lane side. Most of the flow came from Casa de Maria, but we have setbacks on the private road also, so how have setbacks changed? I mean, we're ending up kind of narrow there.
Great question, and that is coming up, so I'm really glad you asked. So setbacks, that's a different ordinance. That's, I believe, 15B. It simply says that development has to stay 50 feet back from the top of the creek bank. And the way we're applying that for recovery projects here in this area is that we recognize there were a lot of homes that were built without that 50 feet. And so we've had numerous examples where and again, each case is unique, okay? We've worked on a number of cases where they either just don't have the 50 feet, it's not available, or, to get the 50 feet, you're going to be chopping down trees, and that was an example in another one that we're looking at. So what we're trying to do is work with each individual property owner, and we're using discretion in that 50 feet. If it's brand new development, unrelated to any of this, then we go for the 50 feet. That's the ordinance, all right? But in this case, we're working with you. And you make an excellent point, moving it further away from the creek. In the case of Randall Road, they got hit from behind. So
the other problem being that we're up at the top, just about. And we have on our property is kind of across the cul-de-sac, which then has gas company access for Casa de Maria. So basically they dug up there, putting in the huge new meters. So there's that part of our property gone. So I didn't know setback-wise, street-wise, we're cut up by that also. So that was my kind of question. And again, living back east now in Virginia, hard for me to pop in all the time or get a meeting or whatever. I leave in a few days. And my mother is actually, we got her out of the house in time, but she's 90 and now living at Maravilla. So I have to come pretty much and handle this with my brother. So how do we get meetings or more information or maps, get everybody together and just conference call?
We can arrange to meet with you via conference call if that's more convenient for you. So just contact the information that was up on the slide, and we'll set something up, and we'll handle it by phone.
Thank you.
Sure. Yeah, there are flyers in the back of the room, too, with the information on it, so you might want to just grab one of those.
Okay, next question.
Okay. My name is Woody Barrett. I'm a professional geologist also. We live in Montecito, and we have the lovely Oak Creek in our backyard. And I noticed it's in the high hazard area. We've lived there 18 years. Last year in February, we had 9.5 inches. I don't know how many hours that was. I was back in Texas working, so in any case, no flooding of that creek at that time. My neighbor, Bill Korchinski, and I made a presentation to the Geological Society here in Santa Barbara on the debris flow. And he did an intense amount of work on investigation on the internet. In 1995, the intersection of 192 and San Ysidro was 2 feet underwater, and Oak Creek didn't flood. And in 1969, Linden Avenue in Carpinteria was 3 feet underwater, and Oak Creek didn't flood. So we're looking at 50 years we know of, it hasn't flooded. A 100-year event is 15 inches in the mountains in 24 hours or 7 inches in the coastal area in 24 hours. So it's interesting to me that we only have 50 years left to have a 100-year flood on Oak Creek because it's considered a high hazard area. And this flood recovery map you have is interesting. I'm glad I came tonight because I didn't know it was a blockage of every bridge, a blockage of every culvert, all debris basins full, and a clear water event. That's the worst case scenario, obviously. And that is also with a burned off watershed area. So I was wondering, in 4 to 5 years, when the vegetation hopefully has grown back, are all these numbers going to change? Because, if you take 9.5 inches last February, there was no flooding, there was no debris flow. And there's an excellent article Bill found, I think it was written in the 1990s. They studied 26 debris flows in California, and what they found was you can have 10 inches of rain in 5 days, no problem. But you get you get the big hit in 1 hour or 2 hours, a ½ inch or more. That's when you have these debris flows. And you have to have circumstances where you have a burned off watershed also. So there's lots of things that have to happen. And that's why Phil said 1,000 years ago was our last one. I was wondering when that was. I thought it was 5,000, but 1,000's good too. So my question is, quite simply, when it grows back the vegetation, do these flood recovery maps change? And of course, they've removed lots of debris from the streams and things of that nature. They've hauled out metric tons of material. And of course, that's changed since January 16th when the elevations were taken. So I just wonder, is this going to be a moving, evolving mapping process, ongoing, hopefully getting better?
Right. Well, I appreciate your comments and being here tonight. I think we've got several of you on the wrong side of the room. You should be up here on our side, I think, helping us answer questions. So John's going to take this question.
So the question is, 4 or 5 years from now, when the watershed recovers, by that time, the FEMA will have the new flood insurance rate maps out. Okay, so those will not be using burned watersheds as the assumption for the runoff. Okay. Or the filled-in debris basins, or et cetera, et cetera.
Right.
I happen to have an opinion that even when the volumes of the debris basins are filled in these extreme events that carry so much volume of water, a filled-in debris basin really doesn't affect it's not, like if it were huge, it could, moderate the downstream flows, but they're not that big.
It had to be the size of Carpinteria Santa Monica Basin, because that's 204,000 cubic yards. Ours here are 17,500, 22,000, 5,500. They're a joke. That's not really a debris basin. Really, they're tiny compared to Santa Monica. And that one was built after the 1969 flood. In fact, there was only one debris basin prior to 1969. So all these were, built off of the USGS survey that was done, I assume, in 1970, 71. And Bill search and I search, I've done .gov, I've done it all. I cannot find that report anywhere.
Well, there were a lot of debris basins built in the 60s after the 1964 Coyote fire by the Army Corps. So, and then the rest of them were mostly built after the 1971 Romero fire.
Do you think 64, maybe 65 was when the USGS survey came out, advising where those debris basins should be built and such?
Can't answer that question. I'm not familiar.
We were trying to find the timing too, and it gets really vague on the net. We can't find anything, so. Okay.
Thank you. We can dig around a little bit more. Tom Favrum probably has something in his desk that probably is matching what you're looking for. Sir.
I just wanted to point out one point on the FEMA rate insurance maps that will be coming out in 4 to 5 years. I think it's just important for everyone to know there is a comment period during that process. So just so you all keep that in mind.
Thank you. Next question.
My name is Richard Cheatham. I'm a real estate agent and a tennis teacher at Knollwood Tennis Club. My family has a home on East Valley Lane, and it's pertinent to what we were just discussing, the debris basins, Santa Monica down in Carp being 208, thereabouts, 1,000 cubic yards. And the debris basins that are above our creeks, specifically San Ysidro Creek, being orders of magnitude smaller than that. As far as I'm aware, the Santa Monica debris basin was built with federal money, and I'm wondering if there are any plans currently in place or what the process is going to look like of addressing the adequacy or inadequacy of these debris basins. And kind of a secondary point on that is that I'm also aware, based on meeting with Ben Romo on site, that each homeowner has the right to protect their home. However, you do not have the right to protect your home in such a way that it would divert any damage or potential damage to any other structure. So it seems like it's either got to be caught up in the mountains before it gets into residential areas, or it needs to make its way all the way down to the ocean. So I guess I'm just wondering, what does the county have in its back pocket? How are we addressing this? Carpinteria seems to have been saved on numerous occasions by this really substantial debris basin, and we've talked about property values, we've talked about property taxes. I think Montecito itself, if it wants to continue to be a place where people build and buy and sell multi-million-dollar homes, a lot of that is going to be based upon this feeling of safety, where we can raise families and so on and so forth. And if we know that our debris basins are incapable of preventing debris flows from destroying our homes, I'd just be interested to know what anybody has to, so any input that you guys have on the plans moving forward to address this issue, any expansion plans, any potential use of eminent domain, any federal money that may be available or may become available, and yeah.
So thank you for the question and being here tonight to share some of your concerns. You know, we've got a lot of things going on. There's a lot into that question and statement, but there are a lot of things that we're doing or working with our partners. I'm going to turn it over to John here in a moment to talk a little bit about some of our hazard mitigation grant projects that are specific to some of the debris basins above Montecito, and what his team is. He's going to tell you a little bit about what he's done to work on applying for some of the grants from that. But it's not just one little thing that's going to build a more resilient Montecito, and obviously there's a lot of things that will come together. First and foremost, if we get a storm predicted like what happened last time, that really everybody feels very confident that it's going to be a super intense part of it or several days in a row, we want to get as many folks out of the area as possible, obviously, because we want to make sure that that people aren't in harm's way. And a lot of the stuff that's happening today with this flood map and the other debris flow maps that we've talked a little bit about are hopefully going to help rebuild the homes to standards that can withstand or avoid a lot more of the risk moving forward. So, and there are also other things going on, discussions with the National Forest on opportunities there to help mitigate some of the debris that comes down before it even gets into the communities. So I'm going to get another piece. You want to add that?
A tiny little piece, which is during the fires, we have the DC-10s. We even had a 747 dropping, I think as many as 20,000 gallons of either Phos-Chek or water on the fires. And they did an amazing job protecting all of our homes and communities. And a lot of this has been talk about the regrowth of that undergrowth to prevent the debris flows. Is there any plan or process whereby we might expedite the regrowth of that foliage by seeding and then and manually sort of doing it ourselves, watering those hills so that we don't have to wait for rain that may or may not come? As you know, we've been in a drought for years and years now, and it to me seems like if we have the plains and we have some water, we've got an opportunity to maybe speed that process up and help everybody in this room by keeping some of that debris up in the mountain, whereas if we just let the natural process take its course, we're waiting on Mother Nature to do it for us.
So good question. And we do have a lot of scientists and biologists working on that for us. With the Forest Service has a burned area review team, and CAL FIRE provided to us a response team. to evaluate exactly what you're saying. And in some cases, it's best to let nature reheal itself, and that is actually faster sometimes than others reseeding. In other cases, reseeding is a preferred alternative. So we're working with some of those teams, and we're constantly assessing that. Some of the very mild winter storms that we've had since the 1/9 date have been really good for the hills, right? They came in very gentle rains, and a lot of the mist and some of the conditions that we've had here locally lately have been really helpful to our regen and our regrowth of some of those native species up there. So we definitely have a lot of folks still looking at that, and we'll be assessing that as we move through the summer and fall, because we're all still in a drought, like you said, and we still want to do what's best. So John, you want to talk a little bit about hazard mitigation?
Yeah, back to your question about, say, the Santa Monica Basin in the Carpentry area. I think we break it down into an immediate, in terms of time frame. Immediate, short term, say 2 to 3 years, and then long term. And so, say in the short term, we're still working on these debris basins. Many of them still have work that remains to be done. Thank goodness that FEMA and the Army Corps came in. We couldn't have, recovered without them. But there was some work left behind that we're still working on. I would perhaps put that into the immediate term bit of work we're doing. In the 2 to 3 year time frame, Matt wanted me to share about some grant opportunities that we're chasing, and we are chasing a number of opportunities, and the ones I think that are most pertinent to your question that we've submitted, and we've passed the initial check, and they're inviting us to go on to the next step in the application process. We've identified Cold Springs Basin, San Isidro Basin, and Romero Basin. 3 projects that we want to go in there and see if we can make them bigger. And we also want to see if we can modify the outlet works, if you will, to make them more effective. We have a basin called the Gubernador Basin, which is a tributary of Carpentry Creek. And 10 years ago, we went into Gubernador and we modified the outlet structure. It was a typical Army Corps debris basin, downstream embankment, grouted rock, and all that, just like all these ones in Montecito are. And we put a notch in the embankment and constructed a structure that allows the fine sediments to go through, but it continues to trap the big stuff. And that's really what we want these debris basins to do. We don't want to trap the fine stuff.
Maybe, I'm thinking, like you said, maybe it's a secondary debris basin if it's a filtration system of catching the biggest, most destructive debris as early as possible, and like you said, making any changes, whether it's to existing structures or new structures, because what I saw on our lane and on Randall Road and in Glen Oaks was simply, if you do the math, the amount of debris that came down versus the capacity of the basins, the capacity of the creeks and the bridges, which we know that's a finite number. The resulting catastrophe is kind of the remainder of that equation of what we can't handle. And so I guess I'd just like to encourage everybody to try and bring that number down as much as possible, whether it's by what you're saying, making tactical adjustments into how they operate, or focusing on the whatever it is that we need to focus on to kind of minimize those 10,000-pound boulders that are still sitting across, in my neighbor's yard. And I understand it's a natural process, but I think we can probably do a better job of catching them, before they get there, sort of get it before it starts.
So John and Tom and the flood control staff would love nothing more than to build another debris basin. But we have one significant challenge in the Montecito area. All the land's held by private individuals. And so if we identified an area where people chose not to rebuild, where the conditions were right, then we would attempt a project there. But we're not going to use eminent domain and take away people's land to do it. That would not be the path that we would choose to do so. But if the community comes forward with an opportunity of land, and it is one of the areas that these guys have already identified as useful for flood control capacity, then we would attempt to put together another project.
And I might also share that this grant funding, if we're successful on those 3 basins, that's a fairly aggressive, this is a 2 to 3 year thing. The agreement with the grant is that you have to have the project in place by the end of that 2 or 3 year period. And then in the longer, like 10-year period, we're working with the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers, and they're going to be looking at these overall bigger systems, such as the Santa Monica system that you were referring to earlier. But projects like that are very long, nothing quick associated with a project like that.
Thank you, John. You want to cover another question that you've got in front of you?
Thank you. Yes, I will. How did the January 9th storm compare to the hypothetical 100-year storm event? Great question. January 9th storm, we all heard about that. Intensity that came through and dropped, 0.54 inches in 5 minutes at Casa Dorinda. Okay, and I believe the statistics state that was for a 5-minute period of time, that was a 200-year event. Okay. But the overall storm itself, from beginning to end, wasn't all that significant. I don't know, what did we get, 3 or 4 inches max? But the interesting thing about that rainfall event on January 9th is that it hit all the triggers that trigger a debris flow, and that was, that intensity. So it doesn't really compare to the 100-year storm event that this recovery mapping indicates. The recovery mapping indicates a 24-hour rainfall amount, which is more interested in the amount of rain that falls over 24 hours. A previous person speaking talked about receiving a certain amount of rain in a certain amount of time. If you receive 10 inches, say in 10 days, it's a lot of rain, but runoff maybe isn't going to be that great. If you receive 10 inches of rain in 5 minutes, then, good luck with that. So the 100-year values that are used in this mapping are extreme. I would say that the 1995 events, January and March, they weren't 100-year, okay? Somebody asked me the other day about the 1969. I don't know if it was or not. I didn't have an answer at hand.
The house across the street from, Randall Road's here, San Ysidro Creek. The house on East Valley was under mud with 2 people clinging for their lives back in the 60s.
Very true.
That was a mud flow event.
I don't.
That was going to be my
I don't
question.
argue that it wasn't a significant event. I'm just not sure. 100-year events are extreme. And sometimes when we think there's an extreme event, I think 1995 was very extreme, but it wasn't. It was maybe a 25, 35-year event. So 100-year events are very extreme.
95 took out our neighbors. The creek did a natural turn right below our house, and they did $30,000 worth of work. That's the metal roof that you see there, because they bolted it down after it came almost to their house. So that was 95.
I'm kind of glad you mentioned that, because it actually
Been an issue.
allows me to mention that in '95, we had creeks fill in January. They got cleaned out. The same parts of the same creeks filled in again. Okay, so when people question this recovery mapping as being perhaps overly conservative because the creek channels are filled in, because that's the way it was in January 16th, on January 16th, that's what happens in debris-laden floods. And so to model it like that, I think is very realistic, because that's really what happens in real flood events. So there was no discussion regarding flood zones and floodways. Shouldn't we expect an expansion of the floodways? Great question. Okay, so flood zones and floodways are designations on the flood insurance rate maps. Okay, and remember that flood insurance rate maps are regulatory maps, and insurance rates are based on them, and all of that. This recovery mapping is not going to be used for insurance purposes, and so therefore there are no flood zones. And there are no floodways either, for that matter. So I hope that answers that question. Please pass on information regarding how survey data changes will help properties based on older surveys. Well, so when I was up there explaining that map before, and I said these pink water surface contour elevations have a number tagged to them, and the number represents the elevation of the water surface. I purposely said it was based on a particular elevation datum. I didn't really get much detail beyond that, okay? But an elevation datum is really nothing more than a reference line, so that when a surveyor goes out, or when a map is done of some sort, they identify whatever that reference line is. Okay, so that you know you're comparing numbers based on the same reference line. So for the FEMA mapping, they use an elevation datum referred to as the North American Vertical Datum of 1988. Now, if there's any surveyors in the room, you know, you can quote whatever that is in your sleep, I'm sure. So that's an elevation datum that consistently references the same stuff. So I don't know if that answers this question or not. Please pass on information how survey datum changes will help properties based on an older survey. Well, you know, if you want to compare pre and post and this and that, you need to be comparing yourself to the exact same elevation datums, because if you're not, then you're not comparing apples to apples. You're just not comparing the right differences. And I don't know if that helps whoever wrote that question. I don't want to put anybody on the spot, but if I didn't answer the question, either let me know now or let me know later. I'll be happy to try and elaborate some more.
And maybe, John, you can stay for a few minutes afterwards. We're going to go to our last question. The lights and the air conditioning is going to go off in 15 minutes. But we'll stick around. We can take some more questions, and more information is coming on another community meeting about this with FEMA here present July 11. We are looking for a location at this moment, so I don't have anything to confirm, but it will be in Montecito, July 11th, and we will stick around. So last question for tonight, and then we'll wait afterwards.
Hi, thanks. This will be quick. So I just want clarification on the 50% rule. It's my understanding, and I'm asking you to correct me if I'm mistaken, that if your home was damaged, not destroyed, and you are in the hazard zone, if the repair cost is less than 50% of the appraised value, then you do not have to comply with the 2-foot elevation rule.
I'm going to restate your question just to make sure I answer your question. Question is if you're in the hazard area.
Yes.
You suffered
damage.
You suffered damage, but the cost to repair don't exceed 50%.
Of the value of your home as it's appraised the day before the disaster.
Correct. I think your answer was right. You're not going to be required to bring the entire structure up to current standards.
Okay, that was my question. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you
So thank you, everybody. Just wanted, as we get up and depart, please make sure that you meet with your case manager. There's a whole lot of stuff that they can explain one-on-one. We're encouraging you to bring your architects and contractors to those meetings, and please let us know how we can help get more information out in the future. Thank you for being here tonight, and have a nice evening.
This conference will end in 10 minutes.
Thank you.
All right, thanks, buddy. Appreciate you being on the line.
What's up?
Happy to participate.